The midday sun beat down upon the dusty thoroughfare of Oakhaven, baking the mud into hard, cracked ridges that threatened to twist an ankle with every misstep. It was a heat that sat heavy in the lungs, smelling of horse manure, stale tobacco, and the acrid sweat of men who had been waiting in line for work since dawn. At the front of the hiring line for the sprawling Double R Ranch stood a figure that drew every eye, not for size or strength, but for the sheer incongruity of her presence. Mei Ling stood wrapped in the faded, dark cotton of her mourning clothes, her head bowed against the glare, clutching a small canvas sack that held everything she owned in this unforgiving world. She was small, her frame appearing brittle against the backdrop of burly cattlemen and roughnecks, yet her spine was as straight as a lodgepole pine. She had not come to beg. She had come to offer the only thing she had left, the strength of her hands. But the foreman of the Double R, a man named Taggart, whose belly strained against his suspenders and whose face was permanently flushed with a mixture of whiskey and cruelty, saw no value in the woman standing before him. He saw only a target for his own petty amusement, a way to make the other men laugh and forget their own desperation. Taggart stepped down from the wooden porch of the general store, his boots thudding heavily, creating a cloud of dust that coated the hem of Mei Ling's dress. He circled her like a predator inspecting a wounded animal, a sneer curling his lip beneath a bushy, tobacco-stained mustache. The crowd quieted, sensing the sport. "Work!" Taggart bellowed, his voice booming across the square, startling a nearby horse. "You come here to the Double R asking for work? Look at these hands, boys!" He gestured wildly to the line of weathered men behind her. "I need men who can wrestle a steer to the ground, not a little willow branch that'll snap in a stiff breeze." Mei Ling did not flinch, though the heat rising in her cheeks had nothing to do with the sun. She kept her eyes fixed on the silver buckle of his belt, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "I can cook," she said, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the thick air. "I can mend. I can wash. I will work harder than any man here for half the wage." Taggart threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that encouraged the others to join in. "She will not work on this ranch," the foreman shouted, spitting into the dirt inches from her shoe. "I wouldn't hire you to slop the hogs, widow. You're bad luck. Everyone knows it." It was then that the foreman's eyes landed on a man standing at the very edge of the crowd, leaning against a hitching post with a stillness that bordered on menacing. It was Holt. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and scarred, wearing a hat that had seen 10 years of rain and a coat that had seen 20. Holt was known in the territory, but not for wealth or success. He was known for the curse of bad land and the solitary life he led at the edge of the canyons, a place where the water ran thin and the soil was mostly rock. Taggart's grin widened, a cruel idea forming behind his eyes. "Tell you what," Taggart announced, raising his voice so the whole town could hear the verdict. "If you're so desperate to work, I'll find you a place. Hey, Holt!" The big man didn't move, save for a slow tilt of his head. Taggart pointed a thick finger at Mei Ling and then at Holt. "You need a hand, don't you, Holt? Since you can't afford a real man's wage, take her. She's cheap. She's desperate. And she's about as much use as that pile of rocks you call a ranch." The insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Holt pushed himself off the post, his spurs jingling with a mournful sound as he walked slowly toward them. The crowd parted, giving him a wide berth. He stopped in front of Mei Ling, his shadow engulfing her. He looked down, his face a mask of granite, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He looked at Taggart, then at the woman. "Get in the wagon," Holt grunted. It was not an invitation. It was a command born of necessity and a silent, simmering rage at the spectacle Taggart had created. The journey to Holt's ranch was a punishment in itself, a 3-hour ride through terrain that grew progressively more hostile as they left the town behind. The lush grazing lands of the valley gave way to scrub brush, twisted mesquite, and red earth that radiated heat like the open door of an oven. Mei Ling sat on the hard wooden bench of the buckboard wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She did not speak. She did not dare to look at the man beside her. Holt held the reins with large, calloused hands, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set in a hard line. The silence between them was louder than the creaking of the wheels or the snorting of the two tired mules pulling them. Mei Ling felt the weight of her humiliation burning in her chest. She had been discarded, tossed aside like refuse to a man who clearly did not want her, a man who had only taken her to end the scene, or perhaps because Taggart was right, he could afford nothing else. Every bump in the road jarred her bones, a physical reminder of her precarious reality. She was a widow in a land that had no use for widows, a foreigner in a place that feared the unknown. She looked at Holt's profile, the jagged scar running down his cheek, the unshaven jaw, the grim set of his mouth. He terrified her, yet he was the only thing standing between her and starvation. When they finally crested the last ridge, the ranch came into view, and Mei Ling's heart sank even lower, though she kept her face impassive. It was a desolate patch of earth huddled against the base of a towering cliff face. The house was little more than a shack of weathered gray timber, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The barn leaned precariously to the left, as if tired of standing against the wind. Fences were patched with mismatched wood and wire, and the few head of cattle visible in the distance looked lean and hungry. This was the kingdom of the unwanted, she realized. Taggart had sent the outcast woman to the outcast land. Holt pulled the mules to a halt in front of the house, the dust settling around them in a choking cloud. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down, his boots hitting the hard earth with a heavy thud. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply walked to the back of the wagon, grabbed a sack of feed, and threw it over his shoulder as easily as if it were filled with feathers. "Kitchen is inside," he said, his voice rough like gravel grinding together. "Pump is out back. Don't expect much." He walked toward the barn without looking back, leaving her alone in the overwhelming silence of the wilderness. Mei Ling climbed down, her legs trembling from the ride and the fear. She looked at the bleak house, then at the retreating back of the giant man. She took a breath of the hot, dry air. She would not cry. She would not run. She would work. The first morning began before the sun had even thought to breach the horizon. The air was cool and blue, a deceptive peace before the hammer of the heat fell upon the land. Mei Ling woke on the narrow cot in the lean-to off the kitchen, her body aching from the tension of the day before. She rose instantly, smoothing her dress, binding her hair back severely. She did not wait for instructions. She knew the language of survival, and it spoke in chores. By the time Holt walked into the kitchen, smelling of sleep and coffee grounds, a fire was already crackling in the cast-iron stove, and a pot of porridge was bubbling. He stopped in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, blinking in surprise. He said nothing, merely grunted and sat at the rough-hewn table. She placed a bowl before him. He ate in silence, the spoon scraping loudly against the tin. The silence was a wall he had built, stone by stone, but Mei Ling was determined to exist within its shadow. After the meal, he stood up, put his hat on, and looked at her for the first time that morning. "Water trough," he said, pointing a thick finger toward the corral. "Scrub it, fill it, then mending in the loft." He turned and left. It was a test. She knew it. He wanted to see if she would break. Mei Ling walked out to the corral. The trough was a massive, hollowed-out log, slimy with green algae and caked with mud at the bottom. The smell was foul, rising up to sting her eyes. She found a stiff brush and a bucket of sand to use as an abrasive. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing thin, pale arms that looked wholly unsuited for the task. But she began. She scrubbed. She poured water. She scrubbed again. The sun climbed higher, transforming the corral into a furnace. The wood of the trough was rough, splintering under her touch. Within an hour, her hands were raw. Within 2, blisters had formed on her palms, bubbled and burst, weeping clear fluid mixed with the grit of the sand. She did not stop. She focused on the rhythm of the work. Scrub, rinse, scrub, rinse. It was a meditation on pain. If she stopped, she would have to think about her husband's grave in the town cemetery. If she stopped, she would have to think about the jeers of the crowd. So she did not stop. The flies buzzed around her face, relentless and cruel, but she merely shook her head and continued. She worked until the wood of the trough was stripped clean of slime, until the algae was gone, until the trough looked as if it had been carved yesterday. Then came the bucket brigade. The pump was 50 yards away, a rusty iron contraption that shrieked with every stroke. She had to carry the water, bucket by heavy bucket, to fill the trough she had just cleaned. Her shoulders screamed in protest. The muscles in her back knotted into tight cords of fire. Her legs trembled with every trip. She counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 50. Pour. Return. 1, 2, 3, 50. The sun was at its zenith now, a blinding white eye staring down at her suffering. She was dizzy, her throat parched, but she refused to drink until the trough was full. From the shadow of the barn, Holt watched her. He was mending a bridle, his hands working automatically, but his eyes were on the woman. He had expected her to quit an hour ago. He had expected to find her crying in the kitchen or sitting in the shade. Instead, he saw a small figure moving with a mechanical, terrifying determination. He saw the way she favored her left side, the way she paused to wipe sweat from her eyes with a shaking wrist, only to grab the bucket handle again immediately. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightening that wasn't quite pity, but was certainly no longer contempt. He spat into the dust and turned back to his work, but the image of her, small and defiant against the vast emptiness of the ranch, stayed burned in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into a routine defined by the rising and setting of the sun. The ranch was a harsh master, demanding everything and giving little in return. Mei Ling became a ghost of the property, a silent force of order in Holt's chaotic world. She waged war on the dust in the house. She wrestled the weeds from the small vegetable patch that had long been surrendered to the earth, and she mended clothes that were more whole than fabric. In the evenings, the silence between them began to change texture. It was no longer the sharp, hostile silence of strangers, but the companionable, weary silence of 2 soldiers sharing a trench. They sat across from each other at the small table, the oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Holt would eat the stew she prepared, simple fare but seasoned with wild herbs she had found near the creek bed, giving it a flavor he hadn't tasted in years. He began to notice things. He noticed how she never complained, not even when the dry wind cracked her lips until they bled. He noticed the grace with which she moved, efficient and careful, never wasting emotion. He noticed that she had taken his torn work shirts and mended them with stitches so small and precise they looked like part of the original weave. One evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, Holt looked up from his plate. Mei Ling was sewing by the light of the fire, her head bent low. He saw her wince slightly as she pulled the needle through the tough denim. He saw the bandages wrapped around her fingers, stained with the day's labor. He cleared his throat, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. Mei Ling froze, looking up with wide, dark eyes, expecting a reprimand. Holt reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin of salve, sliding it across the rough wood of the table. "For your hands," he rumbled, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He stood up abruptly, taking his plate to the basin, turning his back to her before she could respond. Mei Ling stared at the tin. It was a small thing, a simple tin of sheep fat and camphor, but in the context of their barren existence, it was an offering of immense proportions. She touched the lid, feeling the cool metal. He had seen her pain. He had not mocked it. He had sought to ease it. The heat wave broke with the sudden violence of a high plains storm. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the air grew heavy and electric. Thunder rolled down from the mountains like boulders crashing together. Holt was out on the range, checking the fence line in the north pasture, a rugged stretch of land littered with ravines and scree. Mei Ling was in the house, securing the shutters, when she saw his horse, a roan mare named Bess, galloping toward the barn, riderless. A cold spike of terror drove through her chest, sharper than any physical pain she had endured. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the medical kit she had cobbled together and ran out into the rising wind. The sky opened up, rain falling in sheets that stung the skin and turned the dust instantly to slick, treacherous mud. She caught the mare, calming the frightened beast with a firm hand on its nose, and pulled herself up into the saddle. She was not a horsewoman, but fear gave her balance. She kicked the mare into a run, backtracking the animal's trail toward the north pasture. She found him in a ravine, pinned beneath a fallen section of heavy timber fencing that had collapsed in the wind. Holt was conscious, his face pale beneath the tan and the grime, his teeth gritted in agony. The mud was rising around him, the water in the ravine beginning to flow. He looked up and saw her, a dark wraith in the storm, sliding down the muddy bank toward him. "Go back!" he roared over the sound of the wind. "Too heavy! Get back!" Mei Ling ignored him. She reached the timber, her boots sinking deep into the slurry. It was a massive post, soaked with rain, far too heavy for one woman, but Holt was trapped, and the water was rising. She wedged her shoulder under the end of the beam. She planted her feet in the mud. She looked at Holt, her eyes fierce and burning. "Push!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "On 3! Push!" She didn't wait for his agreement. She channeled every ounce of resentment, every ounce of grief, every ounce of the strength she had built over weeks of hauling water and scrubbing floors. She screamed, a primal sound torn from her throat, and drove her legs upward. Holt, seeing her resolve, roared with effort and shoved upward with his free arm in his chest. The timber groaned, shifted, and lifted just enough. Holt dragged his crushed leg free, rolling into the mud with a gasp of relief. The beam slammed back down, splashing muddy water over them both. They lay there for a moment in the pouring rain, chests heaving, covered in muck, looking at each other. The distance was gone. The hierarchy of master and servant, of local and foreigner, had been washed away by the storm. In the mud, they were just two people who had fought death and won. Holt looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time the stoic mask cracked, revealing a flash of raw, terrified gratitude. He reached out a trembling hand and gripped her shoulder. "You," he rasped, the word lost in the thunder, but the weight of his grip said everything he could not. The storm outside raged on, hammering the roof with the fury of 1,000 fists. But inside the small cabin, the world had shrunk to the golden circle of light cast by the hearth. Mei Ling knelt beside the low cot where Holt lay, his massive frame looking strangely vulnerable stripped of his coat and boots. His leg was a mess of purple and angry red, the skin tight and hot to the touch where the timber had crushed it. Mei Ling worked with the focus of a surgeon, her small hands moving deftly to wring out cloth soaked in hot water and vinegar. The air smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and the sharp tang of the liniment. Holt hissed through his teeth as she applied the compress, his knuckles gripping the edges of the blanket until they turned white. "It is broken?" he grunted, the pain making his voice tight and shallow. Mei Ling shook her head, her eyes never leaving his injury. "No break," she said softly, her voice a soothing balm against the backdrop of the thunder. "Deep bruise, muscle tear. You will not walk on it for days. You must rest." Holt stared at the ceiling, frustration warring with exhaustion in his eyes. He was a man defined by motion, by the ability to impose his will upon the land. To be laid low, to be dependent, was a bitterness he found hard to swallow. Yet, as he looked down at the top of Mei Ling's head, at the damp strands of black hair that had escaped her bun and plastered to her neck, the bitterness receded, replaced by a strange, warm ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his leg. She had saved him. The realization was a heavy stone settling in his gut. This woman, whom the town had spat upon, whom he had taken in largely out of spite and necessity, had dragged him from the mud and the rising water. She patted the bandage dry with a tenderness that confused him. He was used to the rough handling of horses and the indifference of the elements. He did not know what to do with gentleness. "You could have left me," he murmured, the words slipping out before he could check them. Mei Ling paused, her hand hovering over his shin. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. In the firelight, her face was soft, the harsh lines of her fatigue smoothed away. "We do not leave those who belong to us," she answered simply. The word belong hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Holt turned his head away to stare at the fire, but his hand moved, almost of its own accord, to cover hers where it rested on the blanket. His skin was rough like bark, hers smooth and pale, but for a moment they were the same. He gave her hand a clumsy, brief squeeze, a silent surrender of his solitude. The weeks of Holt's recovery brought a transformation to the ranch that went deeper than the mendings of fences or the scrubbing of floors. It was a softening of the very air they breathed. Confined to the porch or the fireside chair, Holt was forced to become an observer of his own life, and for the first time he truly saw the woman who shared it. He watched her through the kitchen window as she coaxed life from the vegetable patch, her hands diving into the soil as if greeting an old friend. He saw the way she would pause to watch a hawk circle the canyon thermals, a look of quiet wonder on her face. She was not just a worker, she was a soul, vibrant and resilient. The romance that bloomed between them was not spoken in sonnets or grand declarations. It was written in the language of service, the only language the West allowed. It was in the extra ladle of stew she slipped into his bowl. It was in the way Holt, hobbling on a crutch he had fashioned himself, secretly oiled the hinges of the heavy back door so she wouldn't have to struggle with it when carrying the wash. One afternoon, while Mei Ling was down at the creek washing linens, Holt dragged himself to the pump house. The old iron pump had been a torture device for her, the lever rusted and stiff, requiring a man's weight to operate smoothly. Every time he had watched her struggle with it, hanging her small body weight on the handle to force it down, he had felt a prick of shame. Balancing precariously on his good leg, sweat beading on his forehead, Holt dismantled the mechanism. He filed down the rusted pins, greased the internal piston with meticulous care, and extended the handle by bolting a smooth piece of hickory to it, increasing the leverage. It took him 3 hours of agony, his injured leg throbbing in protest, but he didn't stop until the action was smooth as silk. When Mei Ling returned with her basket of wet laundry, she went to the pump to fill a rinsing bucket. She braced herself for the usual fight, grabbing the handle with both hands. But at her lightest touch, the lever glided down, and clear, cool water splashed instantly into the pail. She gasped, nearly dropping the bucket. She pumped it again, up, down, up, down, effortless. She spun around, looking toward the porch. Holt was sitting there, whittling a stick, his hat pulled low over his eyes, feigning sleep. But the corner of his mouth was engaged in a microscopic twitch, a ghost of a smile. Mei Ling looked at the pump, then at the man. A flush rose in her cheeks, a smile breaking across her face that made Holt's heart hammer against his ribs. She didn't say thank you. The words were too small. Instead, that evening she moved her chair from the other side of the room to sit beside him on the porch, their shoulders almost touching as they watched the sun bleed purple and gold into the canyon rocks. The peace of the ranch was a fragile bubble, and inevitably the outside world came to prick it. Supplies were running low, flour, coffee, and the liniment Holt still needed for his leg. They had to go to town. The morning of the trip, Holt sensed Mei Ling's hesitation. She stood by the wagon, smoothing her dress nervously, her eyes darting toward the road as if expecting an ambush. She remembered the humiliation of her arrival, the laughter of the men. Holt walked over to her, his limp now just a hitch in his stride. He stood before her, blocking the sun, casting her in his protective shade. "You ride up front," he commanded softly, "with me." It wasn't a question of status anymore. It was a statement of unity. He helped her up, his hands lingering at her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a silent promise that the world would have to go through him to get to her. Oak Haven was just as dusty and unforgiving as they had left it, but the atmosphere shifted the moment Holt's wagon rolled down Main Street. Conversations died, heads turned. They had expected to see Holt alone, or perhaps to see the foreigner broken and gone. Instead, they saw Mei Ling sitting high on the seat, wearing a clean bonnet, her face calm and healthy, not gaunt. And beside her sat Holt, looking stronger and cleaner than he had in years, his beard trimmed, his shirt mended and pressed. They pulled up to the general store, the very spot where Taggart had tried to shame them months ago. As fate, or perhaps the devil's luck would have it, Taggart was there, leaning against a pillar, peeling an apple with a knife that glinted in the sun. He straightened as they climbed down, his eyes narrowing. He tossed the apple peel into the dirt and stepped into their path. "Well, look at this," Taggart sneered, his voice loud enough to draw a crowd from the saloon. "The hermit and his pet. I expected you'd have chased her off by now, Holt, or did she finally learn to do a man's work?" The men around him chuckled, low and nasty. Mei Ling stiffened, her chin dropping, the old shame threatening to rise. Taggart took a step closer to her, invading her space. "We don't serve your kind in the store today, widow. Bad for business. Makes the flour taste sour." The air in the street grew thin and sharp. Mei Ling began to step back, to retreat as she had been taught to do by a lifetime of rejection. But a heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. It wasn't rough. It was an anchor. Holt stepped forward, placing himself physically between Mei Ling and the foreman. He towered over Taggart, his shadow swallowing the smaller man. The silence that fell over Oak Haven was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Holt's face was stone, but his eyes were a cold fire. "She goes where I go," Holt said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of the onlookers. Taggart scoffed, though he took a half step back. "Don't be a fool, Holt. She's nothing, a stray dog you picked up." Holt didn't shout. He didn't bluster. He simply stared Taggart down, his hand sliding down from Mei Ling's shoulder to grip her hand, openly, defiantly, interlacing his thick, calloused fingers with hers in front of God and everyone. "She is the lady of the Double H Ranch," Holt announced, his voice ringing with a solemn gravity that brooked no argument. He renamed his land in that breath, giving her half of his name, half of his world. "She works harder than any man standing here. She has more honor in her little finger than you have in your whole lineage, Taggart. Anyone who has a quarrel with her has a quarrel with me, and I am done talking." He squeezed her hand, a signal. "Come, Mei Ling." He turned his back on Taggart, dismissing him as one would a buzzing fly, and led her up the steps of the store. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one laughed. In the West, strength was respected, but loyalty, fierce, unyielding loyalty, was revered. Holt had drawn a line in the dust, and he had placed her on his side of it. Mei Ling walked beside him, her head high, tears stinging her eyes not from shame, but from the overwhelming realization that she was no longer an outcast. She was protected. She was home. The ride back to the ranch that evening was different. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of apricot and violet, casting a soft glow over the rugged terrain that no longer looked hostile, but promising. The silence between them was rich and sweet. They didn't speak of Taggart. They didn't speak of the town. They spoke of the future. Holt talked about buying a new bull in the spring. Mei Ling talked about planting an apple tree near the house, where the runoff from the roof would water it. These were small plans, but to them, they were the architecture of a life. When they arrived at the cabin, the stars were just beginning to prick the velvet darkness. Holt helped her down, but this time he didn't let go of her waist immediately. He looked down at her, the rugged landscape of his face softened by the twilight. "Double H," she whispered, testing the sound of it. Holt nodded, a deep contentment settling in his eyes. "Double H," he confirmed. "For us." He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, chaste, reverent, and full of a love that had been forged in the fire of adversity. It was a promise that the seasons might change, the storms might come, and the world might be cruel, but inside the walls of that cabin, they would be enough. The world is full of Taggarts, voices that tell us we are too weak, too different, or too broken to belong. We all carry the fear that our labor will go unseen, that our worth is determined by the judgments of a crowd. But the story of the ranch tells us a different truth. It reminds us that dignity is not given by others. It is forged in the quiet moments of endurance. It teaches us that love is not found in the easy paths, but in the muddy ravines where we pull each other to safety. Mei Ling found her place not because she begged for it, but because she built it with her own 2 hands. And in doing so, she healed a heart that had forgotten how to beat. Just curious, have you ever felt like you were standing in that hiring line, waiting for someone to see your value? Have you ever had to fight to prove you belong? If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of resilience and the beauty of a love earned through struggle, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their storm will pass and their harvest is coming.